Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for another event hosted by the Cambridge University Social Impact and Sustainability Society. My name is Diana Sukailo. I'm the Vice President of the Society and I'm pleased to be your host today. The topic for today is impact measurement and management for the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs shortly. And we are very much honored to host our presenter, Professor Cathy Clark, whom our Society President, Mr. Navin Seeterram, will introduce shortly. This event is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you haven't already done so, please ensure that your mics are muted for the duration of the session. So our plan for today is the following. We will have our speaker's presentation and then a Q&A session with the audience afterwards. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat window directly to Inessa Collier, our communications director and my co-moderator today. Inessa, could you please wave a hand in the chat box or something so our audience knows how to find you? Brilliant, thank you. So all you need to do is select Inessa's name and type your question there. We will then receive those questions and pass them on accordingly. We promise we will do our very best to get to as many questions as we can. We are also very interested in getting to know our audience, so please say hi in the group chat and where you're from. We're looking to seeing how far is our society reached. Now I'm pleased to pass on to the main event where our president, Mr. Navin Seeterram, will introduce our presenter. Good day to you, Navin.
Thank you very much for that, Diana, for a kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, at the Society, we believe our advocacy for ESG and impact investing best practices must include spotlighting world-class step change content. In that regard, our speaker today, Professor Cathy Clark, not only meets these criteria, but she keeps pushing the boundaries of what that means in the field. Cathy's prolific 30-year career in both theory and praxis sets an example on how we can use business for good by developing the mindsets, tools, markets, policies, and practices which drive social and environmental impact at scale. Cathy is speaking to us today as a faculty director at the Center for the Advancement of Social Entrepreneurship, CASE, at Duke University's Fuqua School of Business, and she's also the founding director of the CASE I3 initiative on the impact investing. Cathy and CASE teamed up with the UNDP's SDG Impact team to develop a free online training accessible via Coursera, and there's a link that we typed in there in the chat. It's entitled the Impact Measurement and Management for the SDGs. She's an award-winning US professor who has taught at Duke University, the University of North Carolina, and Columbia Business School. She's been a professional investor, philanthropist, researcher, and consultant as well. A dynamic and sought-after speaker, she has written and co-authored over 35 publications. Her topic of discussion today is very much ripe for our times. As we are convened here, 197 nations meet in Glasgow, Scotland for COP26, shaping their commitments to policies and practices to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. Vaccinations aim to stem another tide of the evolving COVID-19 to protect healthcare systems and the well-being of our societies. The hashtag BLM, DEI, and LGBTQ movements conscientiously work towards redressing the injustices which arise every day for too many from the undertow of our histories. The main power brokers in any capitalist system, businesses and governments, must optimize for a broader objective than shareholder value or taxable income, the health and wealth of the stakeholders on our planet and that of our future generations. The impact of all these issues cut across many, if not all, the UN's 17 SDGs. It allows for the development of impact measurement and management, or IMM, frameworks. Ladies and gentlemen, we're all aware that a decision not to measure and not to manage is a decision for unaccountability and mismanagement. Cathy's discussion will offer a taste of an antidote. Her topic for today is a course introduction which will enable investors and enterprises to meet in the middle in the endeavor of having a sustainable, positive net effect towards social or environmental change. And so with that, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Cathy. Cathy, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Navin, and thanks everyone for giving us your time today. I'm really honored. I'm going to share my screen, perhaps awkwardly, but I'll get it there, so that we can all follow together. Is that all good? Can people see that? Great. So what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about the background for this course, why we thought it was needed in the field, and then I'm going to give you kind of a little peek of an overview going through how the course is organized, and what you can learn doing this course. If we have time, I'm going to try to do this all in about 20 minutes. I might do a little bit of a deeper dive into one of the modules, and then I'm just delighted to come out and have some Q&A with you all. So to start with, as Navin mentioned, we've just launched this new online course on the Coursera platform called Impact Measurement and Management for the SDGs. And he also mentioned a little bit of the origin story, which is that we were commissioned to develop this in partnership with the UN Development Program. The UN Development Program, as many of you know, is the group that created the Sustainable Development Goals in consultation with many, many people and governments around the planet. And the goals have now been signed on by 190 countries for specific global outcomes that we are collectively trying to reach by 2030. They realize that there isn't enough money in the public space in the governmental sector to achieve these goals. And so it's going to require collaboration from the private sector. So there is a group within the UN Development Program called SDG Impact, which has been focused on how do we support the private sector in getting better at actually addressing sustainable development goals in their work. How do we support them? How do we educate them? How do we set new standards of practice so that it's easier for people to go from, I think I might want to help, to I know that I'm actually helping. And so we're part of that process. The course that we built is on the whole idea of how do you measure and manage impact broadly. And then within that broad scheme, we have aligned ourselves with the SDG Impact Standards, with other standards that exist for both enterprises and investors, and show the goal of this course is to, within about 10 hours, allow any manager of an enterprise or an investment firm or a support organization to learn how to align with these standards and to do so in ways that aligns with new policies and regulations also coming out around some of these things. So it's really supposed to be a how-to guide and a shortcut process. There's, as part of this work, we spent 2 years developing this course. We read probably 100 different reports or more. They all have their own acronyms and it can get very dizzying. So part of this, the goal of this was to make this easier for people and to allow people to watch very short videos, take some quizzes, see examples, download guides and other resources, but really kind of learn how to do it for themselves in a simpler way. So this is just the 3 partners that I mentioned, the UNDP, the SDG Impact team, and my team at CASE, which is a division of the Duke Fuqua School of Business in North Carolina. So let me just dive in a little bit to how this is organized. So we took the practices that exist within this broad field, and there are many, many, many of them, and we boiled them down to 4 essential steps. And we call these the universal steps because we believe that they are the essence of really trying to measure and manage the impact that a business has on its stakeholders or on the planet. And so I'm just going to walk through these one by one for a little, and then we'll go a little bit deeper. So the first one is to set your strategy. When you're talking about SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs come with specific target outcomes. So part of the process is saying, which of these outcomes do we care about? Which of these outcomes do our stakeholders care about? And how do we kind of set the targets that are important to us going forward that we actually want to work on? The second step is how do you operationalize those targets? So it's one thing to say I have a target, or I have 3 targets, or I have 10 targets. It's another thing to say, what am I going to change in terms of what I do every day to try to start to meet those targets? And what we realized is that you often need to assemble resources, you may need new tools, you may need to assign people differently to do this work, and you definitely need to set up some new processes. And so we have a module just focused on how to turn this into reality inside your organization. The third step is the one that is closest to my heart, because as I was starting to do this work and look into the standards that are emerging around the world, what became very clear to me is that a lot of people kind of skip from integrate to reinforce. And we wanted to make very clear that there's a step in between. The optimized step is the actual management. That's the step where you're collecting data out of the processes that you might have set up during integrate, and you're using that data all the time or on some regular basis, usually it's quarterly, to make decisions about how you are going to manage your impact in line with your financial and other risk goals. And so this optimization becomes kind of a governance practice, and that we would like to see more people integrating into their practice. Many people are going straight to the reinforce stage, which is about how do I tell people what I've done? How do I report on it? How do I share that? How do I maybe align with a third-party standard and have them verify it? How do I issue a public report or get to my stakeholders and so on? And so we really wanted to clarify that you want to be optimizing before you report, and you want to spend as much time on each of these steps. For those in the group here who may be familiar on the investment side, there are other standards emerging as well. And so I did want to show how carefully we worked to align the SDG Impact Standards framework, which is on the left, the circle, and the operating principles for impact management, which is a framework that is transmitting throughout the financial community pretty rapidly. The operating principles are 9 principles that you can decide to adhere to. And if you sign up and become a signatory to those principles, you have to have a third party come in and verify that you're doing them. And what I just wanted to show on this slide is that our 4 steps align with both. You know, we have 2 that are setting strategy, 2 that are about integrating. Optimize is actually 4 of the principles, and reinforcing at the end. And so we could do a similar mapping with some of the enterprise standards like the Global Reporting Initiative or UNPRI. They all have these elements, and that's why we call these steps universal. So the next thing I want to tell you is kind of how we make this easy for people, because 10 hours is not a lot of time. And so one of the teaching tricks that we used was to create personas. And so it's easier for a learner to figure out what they should be doing if there's a person that is sort of like them to follow. And so we created these 4 personas in the training. We created 2 which are kind of in the enterprise role. They are managers of enterprises trying to have impact. And 2 of them are in the investor role. The enterprise managers, Grace is the manager of what I would call an impact enterprise, somebody who exists primarily to have impact. Miguel is a manager of a division within a very large multinational company who happens to be working in an area that aligns with an SDG. On the investor side, Akil represents an investment fund manager, like a VC fund manager or a debt fund manager. And Paula represents an asset owner. So she's actually working within a pension fund, but that could be a foundation or a sovereign wealth fund or a high net worth individual. It could be anybody who actually owns these assets. And so what these roles that are throughout our training allow people to differentiate, what am I responsible for versus what is somebody else in the value chain responsible for? And that becomes really important, as I'll show you the next slide, in that when we put these 2 things together, the 4 universal steps and the 2 roles, this becomes how we actually designed our training, so that you look at set strategy first from the enterprise point of view. What decisions does the enterprise need to make about setting their impact strategy? And then you look at it from the investor point of view. And they have different roles and different issues and very different stakeholders. For example, often within an enterprise, you are trying to figure out how to have direct impact on one of your stakeholders. Is it your customers? Is it your employees? Is it your supply chain? And so on. The investors have a different set of stakeholders that have different needs and are often a little bit removed, at least one arm's length and sometimes multiple arm's length from the enterprise actually having impact. We do the same with the other modules. And so really going into a lot more detail on the enterprise side, for example, about how you choose metrics and how you put together your collection efforts around metrics. And then a lot more on the investor side about how do you diligence deals, how do you change the way that you make decisions about what to invest in and how to manage them, for example, along the way. So now what I want to do just for a few minutes is just walk you through a little bit more detail under each module. I'm very visual, and so I'm hoping this will kind of cement in your head what's in here with a little bit more detail so that if you wanted to go back and go into it, you could. The first module of the course, which is it's a 5-module course. One is an intro, and then we have one for each of the steps. The first module goes through some of the basics. One basic has come out of the Impact Management Project, which some of you may know is a collaborative group that was created about 3 years ago to try to set common conventions in the field of impact measurement and management. And one of their primary contributions is the idea that impact is multidimensional. And that there are actually 5 dimensions of impact and that you can start to understand or track. And so the idea of the 5 dimensions is you may not have all of them in any one enterprise or one investment, but the more you have, the more information and confidence you have of that impact is actually occurring. The second part of the module is around what are the SDG Impact Standards? Who are they for? How do they work? It turns out there are standards both for enterprises and for investors, and it's the only standards group that's tried to bridge across both, and that we use that in this training. And there's also some reference guides there. So if you want a quick, print out a checklist of what this standard is asking you to do, you can do that. So when we go into the setting strategy module, I'm not going to go through all of these in a lot of detail. This is the largest module. You go from, in the investor part of this, you go from defining your investment thesis. What is the thesis of your entire portfolio in terms of its financial objectives? What are the SDG outcomes or targets that are most relevant to your stakeholders? And the kind of investor you are makes a really big difference in the kind of stakeholders you have. If you're one high net worth individual, you may be your sole stakeholder, or your family might be. If you're a university, you have students, professors, donors, board members, many, many others. The third step is to prioritize those SDG outcomes, which is to really say which of these outcomes that we think we might want to target actually fit with our investment thesis and the kind of capital and the risk of that capital that we're going to take. And so you're looking for aligned models where the kind of investment thesis you have can co-align with the SDG impact that you're trying to achieve. Then you develop a thesis about that, which is you define what you think you're trying to achieve in more tangible ways. And then we have this other structure called ABC, which I'm sure is not known by most of you in here, but the ABC is a way of classifying the kind of target that you are trying to make with your investment. And we have a tremendous amount of detail on how to start classifying your investments by A, B, or C. The A, B, or C is really important because you will collect different data depending on whether your goal is an A goal, a B goal, or a C goal. And if we have time at the end during Q&A, I can talk a little bit more about that. The last thing you do under setting strategy is you try to embed this into your governance. And so we actually have a whole reference module on investment policy statements. This is what most investors use to kind of codify their goals and how you can embed impact and SDG targets and practices into your governance documents. Second is integrate, and this one is about how do you integrate your impact into all phases of the investment cycle. I wrote a book a few years ago where we studied high-performing investment funds, and we saw at the time that those funds were defining their mission at the beginning and then testing it at the end. That is no longer best practice. Best practice now is figuring out how do you integrate impact into every step of what you do. And I'll show a little bit more about that in a minute. The second thing that every impact investor must do is select new investments. And so we have a module on how do you actually create impact diligence and add impact diligence to the financial diligence that you may have already been doing. And we show different frameworks to use for that. And then the third one is how do you prepare to monitor the information that you're going to get once you make this investment. So there is some pre-work to do. As an impact investor who's investing in SDGs, you can't just wait until the end. You actually have to think through what are you going to be looking at to make better decisions around the alignment of each investment with your thesis. The optimized step, we have broken down into these three kind of very, very simple questions, but it turns out they're very powerful. The questions are on some regular basis, which is right for you. Maybe that's quarterly, maybe that's annually. What happened? What is the data telling you about the impact that you hoped would happen? Why did it happen? What are the deviations from the plan? It means you have to have a plan, which you do during the integrate phase. What are the deviations and what are the reasons that you can try to make meaning from over or underperformance? And then the third one is what actions are you going to take? The enterprise has a set of action options that it can take, and the investor has a set of action options that they can take. Honestly, the investor action options are generally a much smaller subset. I can hold on to this investment. I can sell this investment. I can engage to increase the impact. I can get mad that the impact didn't happen, right? There's a whole bunch of things that you can do, but the enterprise has a lot more control under this. And so realizing for an investor to take on the mantle of being a strong impact manager, they need to be asking these questions on a recurring and regular basis. And seeing how their investments or their investees are actually managing their own impact commitments. The last one is reinforcing, which, sorry, I just clicked ahead because I was moving one of my menus around. The reinforce step is how are you going to deepen your commitment in your governance? How are you going to disclose externally? And there are new disclosure requirements in many jurisdictions around the world, including Europe, and we hear soon in the US. About having to disclose different kinds of information about climate, for example, or about how you're treating your workforce. And then the third step, which is new, but it is part of the SDG Impact Standards, is that they urge you to seek a third party to verify that this process and practices are occurring. And we talk in the training about what are the different people who are doing that, how do you prepare for that, and what do you do with what you get back? And turn it into a learning experience for you and your firm. So I just went through all of the steps in the sub-steps in the 4 universal steps, right? So this is what it looks like when you put it all together. Each of these steps is usually a 5 to 6 to 10 minute video, right? So to give you a sense of kind of how this unfolds, and you watch a video and see some documents and take a quiz and then see some examples and move on. There is, alongside all of this from the investor point of view, we also have the same steps from the enterprise point of view. And so, you know, that you get to see them twice, but we try very hard to distinguish what the enterprise needs to be doing. For example, under Integrate 2, deciding what to measure, there's a ton of detail about how do you start to get into the 5 dimensions of data. How do you decide to make trade-offs, because no one can measure everything that is happening with every stakeholder. How you decide what's important, how you decide what's efficient to measure, and how you build it up over time. So we do have a few minutes. So what I thought I would do now is just take you through a little bit more detail of one of these steps. And so what I was going to do is just show you a few slides from one of the videos inside the Integrate module for investors. So this is about integrating impact into the investment cycle. So what we say to the investors is there's a series of things that you are going to do just because you're an investor that you're already doing. They range from sourcing new deals, diligencing deals, deciding to make or not the investment, closing the deal and what terms you put into the deal, monitoring and management, and then exiting from the deal. And what we then start to point out is you can integrate impact thinking into each of these steps. And we give some examples. So, you know, do you have relationships with networks where investments matching your goals might be located or cultivated? Do you have criteria in place that are actually excluding higher impact investments? And I'm going to give you a tiny example of this. It's very common right now among large asset holders to be screening for either climate reinforcing investments or investments that have more of a racial equity lens. But if they have criteria that make it difficult to invest in newer funds, for example, many of the funds that are addressing racial equity are just newer. They're newer in the marketplace. And so they might need to dial down some of their criteria in order to fulfill their impact needs. We have the same sort of thing under due diligence. Do you have a clear narrative for the potential of each investment? Have you integrated those criteria? Have you actually done a projection of the impact that you expect? And that's extremely important. We have a whole other module, as I said, just on impact diligence, where we go into the detail of that. Under investment decision-making, how are you weighting the impact factors alongside the financial factors? Is there a threshold? If something doesn't have any impact or might have a harmful impact, are you still going to invest in it? Do you have the right composition of people making that decision? This has come up a lot in gender lens investing. Do you have the diversity of experience and background that you want to represent in making decisions about a certain area? Or do you have climate experts, for example, on your board if you're investing for climate? In closing and deal structures, do you have deal terms that are related to impact management performance? We go through in the training, there are several funds that have made some very interesting incentive arrangements for their managers to be rewarded when impact goals are met, not just financial goals. And controversially, we see several funds who are actually penalized when their impact goals are not met, right? So to change the motivation for someone to take on this management in a deeper way. Under monitoring and management, are there ways that you're going to contribute actively to the impact during the ownership phase, which is easier to do if you're an equity investor than if you're a debt? But there are a lot of other things that you can start to add to the way you engage with your investments. And then, of course, a big one that many people talk about is how do you assure that the impact stays inside this company as you exit as a financial investor? Can you define the criteria for an impact-aligned exit? Can you influence the decision-making around exit options that come to you to assure that the stakeholders who are experiencing impact from this investment continue to experience that as the investment changes ownership? So this is just I wanted to give you this one slide, which is a piece of this module that we end on. This is Akil, who I mentioned to you as our persona. He actually runs a VC firm in India in our training. And he and his team decided that there were going to be 5 SDGs that they were going to try to address through their venture capital fund. And this is showing you that they went through the sourcing, the due diligence, the investment decision-making, and decided that they were going to need to change some of their practices for the different level of goal that they had. So the climate action, good health, and quality education, they're doing at a B level. And so here are the changes that they made, to those different items at the B level, but they made the most changes at the C level, because a C level investment requires that you compare to some sort of benchmark or peer and show that you are making a significant contribution compared to that peer. And so they realized they actually needed to do it, for example, under monitoring and management. They needed to integrate a benchmarking process to make sure that their C investments are actually C investments, or else they need to downgrade them to something else. So I know that's a lot, and I didn't define all the terms, but I wanted to give you a sense of how visual and case-based this is. Many times we spoke to many investors and enterprises, and we took things that they were doing and anonymized them and put them under these personas. So it allowed us to share a lot of current practice going on now. So I am happy to take some questions. I have not been looking at the chat, but I can turn off the screen. Actually, I'm going to leave the screen on for a second, but I'm happy to take some questions.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that. Very good job, Cathy. Let me just get on to the questions. Right. So, okay, we have a few questions coming in. The first question for you here is, sometimes there is a misalignment in targets and outcomes based on geography. So we struggle to align our outcomes. For example, to align life skills with a SDG specific target. How can we align ourselves? It feels like these targets are not aligned with work done in the global south.
That's really interesting. So I don't know that specific target very well. I will say that the UN has tried very hard to work with groups in the global south to develop these targets. I do not speak for them. I do think that, what your job is to do is to interpret what you think is needed in your community and be very explicit about your own targets. So that's what I would recommend. I would recommend transparency and clarity about what you and your stakeholders believe is important and what you think you can have an impact on, and stick to your guns in the clarity of that.
I would also say, I think for the work Cathy has put forward here in relation to SDGs and being able to create measurability, right, would help. It goes a long way in terms of having to manage the process. So it can be done into preventing impact washing, and will give better clarity for funds and investors in this space here, and for enterprises to make that impact, which is much needed. And the UN framework does help support that. Okay, so I have the second question now is, so we know what needs to be done and how things can be done. The question is, in the light of social and environmental tipping points, and aside from volunteerism, how do we get decision makers to actually do it?
That's really the question I think that some of the policymakers are dealing with right now, right? Which is to say, we've had voluntary disclosures and reporting for a very long time.
Right.
And, I was just discussing this with my class the other day. Part of the issue when things are voluntary is that it costs money to do these, right? It costs time and money to decide what your goals are and measure things and put people on it and do this. And so it's a little bit of an unequal playing field. If it is required from everyone, the way that financial accounting is required from everyone, right? It's a more equal burden, and then you can start to compare apples and oranges. So I really do, recommend that you think about this a little bit like, what if we were 15 years or 10 years before, the global accounting standards were formed. And people were putting different things into their financial reports, and sometimes it looked like a balance sheet and sometimes it didn't. And, you weren't sure how to compare it. You weren't sure whether to trust it because we didn't have an accounting industry to say, here are the rules of the road. Here's the opinion that we made by digging in. That's really what we're trying to create. We're trying to say you have a responsibility for financial management and you have a responsibility for impact on your stakeholders. And, I am personally a little confused about why we have all of this infrastructure to manage the financial part, but we are assuming that it's okay for people to say, I just have a goal on that side. Believe me, it isn't enough, right? With the kinds of problems that we're trying to solve. And so what's happening is, this is just a piece of it. We're trying to create the infrastructure. We're trying to create the norms, the accountants, the verifiers, the expectation that this is part of doing business. And so what's happening on the policy level is that a lot of policymakers are agreeing and starting to step in. So for example, I mentioned the ABC structure. The ABC structure, which I could go deeper on if someone wants, I have more slides on. But the ABC structure matches the new financial disclosure requirements in Europe. It is very, very similar. So it's already starting to become required for certain firms to start to use this new nomenclature. And that's why we think it's so important to kind of get the word out of it and make this free, so that this transformation can happen a little faster. And it's easy to see how people can move just a little bit further in their practice. You don't have to do all of it at once, right? This is a journey. Everyone's in a different place in the journey. But if I were running a fund or a company right now, I would want to get a little bit of ahead before the policymakers get ahead of me. That's what I would want.
Yeah. Okay, and even to that point, I think if you go to as far as impact C to that level, it does help to at least prospect new opportunities that could even create new economic opportunities and new impact things that could come out of it as well. Just some prospecting in those spaces. So, okay, we have the next question coming out here. Is how correlated is impact investing to LP's appetite? Well, limited partners' appetite, it is a nice to have and matters less than financial return. Well, is it a nice to have and does it matter less than financial
Right.
return?
Is it mandatory or is it a nice to have? So I was at an event sometime in the past month, and I've been to so many that I do not remember which one it was or who was speaking, but it was somebody, I think it might have been someone at, might have been S&P. It was you know, somebody in a large rating agency, and he basically said, you know, the feel, this was not a scientific study, but his feel within a mainstream financial institution was that most of the push to integrate impact and ESG are coming from the investors and coming from the LPs and the asset holders, that there are large pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, you know, very large pools of capital who are very, very concerned about the material risk, for example, of climate change on the long-term prosperity of their stakeholders. So I'm familiar with CalPERS, which is the largest pension fund in the US, who has had 3 years of conversation about this and changed their policies to say, it is our responsibility to look after not just our shareholders today, but our shareholders in the next generation and the generation after. And we feel like climate is a risk that we must integrate into our decision-making. So I think it's actually coming from the top of the value chain down at the moment. I think with social enterprise, it was kind of coming from the bottom and then kind of stopped. But I think what's happening now is you see large investment funds, you see accounting firms, and so on at the very largest ends saying, these are risks that we know are going to come bite us if we don't manage them. And so we want to see, you know, I as a pension fund manager cannot make somebody 3 steps down the chain do something unless they are already doing it, right? I just don't have the impetus to, you know, I'm putting it into a fund of funds and they're investing in funds and they're investing in enterprises. I can't touch that enterprise. I can't touch those funds. But what I can say is, here are my policies. Here's what I'm going to look for and be consistent with that. That is happening at a very large scale right now, that awareness. What is not necessarily happening is all the practices along the chain being aligned enough for people to tell the story, kind of going back up the chain of here's what we achieved. This is what these toolkits are about, to say, if you use these tools, it can be easier to communicate up and down the chain.
Yep, great. Yep, very much agreed. So, okay, don't mean to rush it through, but there's a bunch of flood of questions coming in. So another one thing.
Good.
Yeah.
Questions are good.
Yeah. Is there a different level of interest in impact metrics or impact thinking from LP investors, depending on the type of fund being managed? Example, hedge funds, private equity, VC, etc.
Ooh, that's a good one. I don't have a scientific answer on that. I see a lot in equity. And most of the market is debt, and I see some in debt as well. I don't know as much about real estate, or I mean, obviously the insurance industry is, you know, trying to deal with climate in a very real way.
Right. Okay. Right. So good. Let's say the other question: the ESG data measuring impact or not is a bit of a jungle. There are many standards, conflicting information, and so on. Could you clarify whether the B Corp certification is an alternative to reporting based on ESG data?
So the B Impact Assessment, which is the survey that the B corporations need to take and pass in order to become a B corporation, along with governance changes, helps a company measure and benchmark its impact on various stakeholders. Turns out that all companies have the same kinds of stakeholders, but they have very different impacts on those stakeholders. Can you translate that into an ESG framework? You absolutely can. And in some ways, I think the B assessment is much more detailed and comparable than most ESG frames, which are very loose and very heterogeneous. So I was actually part of the group that created the B Impact Standards. So I'm a little bit prejudiced. I need to be truth in advertising. But the idea of one concrete standard where you get a score and everyone's score can be compared is just much tighter on the B corporation side than it is in the ESG universe, where most people can, create their own construction of what ESG factors they want to create. Because of that, there are groups now trying to connect them and trying to say, what is the core set of metrics that every ESG analysis should have, for example? That's exactly what the B is. The B impact assessment is a core group of metrics. And so they're starting to approach each other.
All right. Okay. Okay, next question is, how can we ensure that when investors focus on one SDG, they are subtracting from other SDGs? That's a question.
So yeah, the question is kind of how do the SDGs interrelate?
Yeah.
And what is the responsibility of a company to deal with that interrelation? There is a very strong concept inside the SDG Impact Standards, which is that you as a company are responsible for alleviating all of your material negative impacts on SDGs and making progress on positive, but you are primarily responsible for alleviating negative ones. That means any stakeholder in your value chain who feels that they are being materially negatively affected by your company, you are responsible for managing that. That is a big deal. That is a definition of materiality that is larger than the normal financial materiality. This is stakeholder materiality, which matches Global Reporting Initiative, UNPRI, and a bunch of other standards. But so it's not new, but it's very clear that you're responsible for the ones that intersect. You're responsible for whatever creates the most negative impact on a stakeholder. For example, if you're polluting in a community outside of your manufacturing, you're responsible for managing that. Maybe to a greater degree than you're responsible for giving away a grant to educate kids in the same community.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I just want to make sure we're getting the time. So sorry to rush you, but so the other question, we always do our best to get to all the questions. The other question is, how can we reconcile projected impact goals and actual impact given the challenge of long time frames and random trials?
Yeah, so you guys might have noticed that I did not talk about random control trials at all in this. What we're really trying to do, and you could disagree, is we're trying to take the expertise of academic and in-depth monitoring and evaluation, which has to do with statistical validation of differences, and translate it into something that more companies can do as a part of their regular business. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't go get a random control trial to prove something at some point. And in fact, we have an example in the training of a impact investment fund that worked with an enterprise. In the first year, they set goals around metrics. In the second year, they set goals around benchmarks. And in the third year, they did a random control trial because they realized they don't do random control trials with all of their investees, but this particular investee, their customer was the government, and the government needed that level of evidence. So it comes down to what is the level of confidence and evidence that your stakeholders need about your impact. And that varies. And so it goes from something that's very cheap to, tracking your own things to something that's usually very expensive, setting up a random control trial.
Right, I hope that addressed that question sufficiently enough. I think I did. Next question is, did you assess the various methods for impacting innovation such as responsible innovation, open innovation, real-time technology assessment, etc.? And if so, which approaches are seen as best practice models in the industry?
I don't know that field. I don't even know most of those terms. So that's beyond my knowledge.
Okay, so for the question, note that I guess that may be fueled for the research. I'm afraid. Okay, so this question says, Cathy, I'm interested in how a venture organization is scored comparatively. I'm attempting to integrate this through a framework I'm developing. Oh, I think I understand the source of this question. Yeah.
So what's the question?
The question is, let me repeat again. Well, just want to, let me see, get back to it. I just scrolled down. Well, it's interesting how a venture organization is scored comparatively.
So you mean how a venture, meaning a venture or a venture capital, an organization or a funder?
Yeah, I guess I will, let's address it as a funder.
A funder. So how does a funder benchmark themselves against other funders is the question?
Yeah, and then we can maybe look at it from the perspective of, let's say, an enterprise, I suppose.
Yeah. So one of the rationales for the SDG Impact Standards and the operating principles is to do just that, is to say, here is a set of concrete standards, and an investor can walk through the standards almost like a checklist, and say, like, I can go back up to that slide for a second.
Okay.
I'll just click for a while. So when we had the operating principles, for example, you know, are you establishing under principle 3 the manager's contribution to the achievement of impact? Are you monitoring the process, right? What our training does is goes into each of those and has more detail, right? So by the time you get to our training, you know, you're not just looking at the principle, you're saying underneath the principle, are you doing all of these things? What the third-party verifiers are doing. So right now there's a third-party verification of the operating principles. You can go to the signatories page. It's on the IFC website. There's over 122 signatories who are trying to do these practices and having a third party verify. Every single one of those verification reports is public. And so you can see whether your peer funds are doing these things or not, or what they're still working on. The SDG Impact team at the UN is creating a similar verification process, which is going to be rolled out shortly. So this idea that, how do I compare myself to others? Well, that's going to get easier and easier as these kind of new verification and certification processes become more widespread.
All right. Okay, and here's the other question now coming into it. What is the role of venture philanthropy and blended finance and their different impact goals in the same project?
So blended finance, for those of you who are not familiar with the term, is a term for people who are putting together different slices of capital into the same deal. And usually those different slices have different impact goals, different return goals, but they're all functioning within, let's say, the same fund, right? So let's say a fund has, you know, an equity pool, it may have a debt pool, and it may have a loss reserve pool, right? So each person within that deal, within those structures, has a different set of needs. And the blended finance puts those needs together and allows all of them to invest in something that's much larger than if they were trying to do it separately. It reduces risk and so on. Venture philanthropy, I think of as slightly different. Venture philanthropy is a style of investing or grant making that incorporates a lot of kind of venture capital principles. Sometimes it's done as debt, sometimes it's done as grants. Those are all encompassed in this new world. And often the blended finance deals are a little bit of a step ahead in terms of a lot of these practices, because they are very explicit about their theory of change, their investment thesis, their impact thesis, and their measurements, right? So those are actually great examples. And the most concrete example of the blended finance deal are what's called social impact bonds or pay for success contracts, where the financial investors in those deals do not get paid unless impact occurs. It's impact dependent, or impact dependent financial return. And so, those are, I think of those as like off the charts in terms of impact measurement and management. What we're trying to do is bring other people along to start to play around with the same principles.
Fair enough. Okay, so, and then we have, I think we may be able to get to all the questions, which would be good. I think so. Okay, so could you clarify to what extent you approach pairs with a triple bottom line, please?
I'm sorry, can you say that one more time?
Could you clarify to what extent you approach pairs with a triple bottom line?
Yeah, so triple bottom line is usually saying there's a financial bottom line, there's a social bottom line, the impact on people, and there's an environmental bottom line, an impact on planet. If you think about those, right, that's a financial one, a social one, and an environmental one. So that's E and S of exactly. ES and G. Yeah. And then the financial, which we've always had. So, for the SDGs, the SDGs are specific outcomes on people and planet.
Yeah.
Most of them are people. some of the biggest ones are planet. There's water, there's energy, there's climate, right? There's a bunch of things. So the SDGs are, in a sense, the laundry list that the globe has made about the impacts on those things that we all collectively want to achieve. So this is completely aligned.
Yeah, right. Okay, so with the focus currently on climate change and standards such as TCFD, how do you encourage investors to care equally about SDGs and to choose to invest in companies that are signed up to the UN Global Compact?
So the SDGs, the TCFD standards are a subset of the SDGs, right? It addresses specific climate disclosure, which is one of the SDGs. So, you don't need every company to do everything.
Yes.
But go back to the principle of what I said before, is you want to make sure that companies who do have material negative impacts are managing them. So think about the kind of company that it is, right? If it's an oil and gas company, there might be some negative impacts that it needs to manage, and climate disclosures might be very important. If it's an online, retailer, somebody working out of his basement, doesn't need to be TCFD compliant because there's almost no differential gas being put out into the environment, right? So it depends, right? People are going to look at these things and try to say, what is the, but he might, the SDG that might, make a really big difference for that guy could be how he pays his employees, and whether he gives them a living wage, and whether they have good benefits. And, that's another SDG, is about living wage. So, living wage, it cuts across everything, and climate cuts across most things. And then many of the other ones are really kind of industry dependent.
And maybe even contribution to like innovation and things, which is another SDG.
And partnerships, and like there's these softer things that are important as well.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so the question is, in terms of managing negative impacts, how much foresight is expected by companies inside the investment portfolio?
How much foresight, meaning how, and I didn't talk about short-term, long-term. Somebody asked before, and I think I forgot to get to that. So maybe I can fold it into this one. There is a disconnect, which the UN acknowledges, between quarterly financial reporting and long-term impact on sustainable development. There is no question, right? The definition of sustainable development is development that puts the well-being of future generations on an equal footing to the well-being of current generations, right? It is about managing the future. It is about foreseeing the future enough to start to manage it. That's what sustainable development is. So, and that is very different from meeting your quarterly goals. And so one of the standards is about, can the organization acknowledge that and start to address that at the highest levels of the organization, from the CEO on down? Can you start to address that some of these sustainable issues are going to be beyond the quarterly cycle, and that you're going to manage them on a basis that shows that you see them as longer term issues? And climate is a great example of that, right? So most people are not directly negatively affected right now. Some people are, but that's going to change over time if we do nothing. And so you have to be forward looking in order to think about how a company will change its behavior now to meet those needs.
Okay, all right. Okay, we have one question just getting clarification. I've skipped to the other question. We have, do you think that an impact investment private equity fund should be measured for their strict investment policies regarding impact in each single investment at the time of investment? Or should the fund be better focusing on their contribution in their portfolio and show improvements while they are investors?
Can I choose both?
Yeah.
So I think both are important. Now, if I had to say which one is more important, it would probably be the latter. I think that a company should be responsible for choosing good investments, but if you're already in a portfolio and you can't unchoose those, the most important thing is how do you manage them? And I think that there's actually more opportunity for positive contribution to an investment through the management process than there is simply from the selection process. Right. So I would weight it towards the latter. I don't know if the person who asked that agrees. If they want to talk about it in the chat, please do.
Okay. All right. Okay. So we're almost finished with the Q&A, but I think we're doing okay for time. So the other question is, do you think we need a centralized platform that gathers and presents ESG data and makes this information accessible and open source?
I do not.
Oh, can I ask why is that?
I do not need to see every, I mean, when you actually get into this, right? I don't think I need to see every single metric that a company is collecting. And I actually think some of that is proprietary. What I care about is what is their adherence to their goals? What is the progress being made? And as some third party told me that I could be confident in what they've said. I don't think, I mean, I think about the B Corp experience, and there's a platform and people, you know, they don't put their data in there. They put their evaluation of their data in there. And then what's public is how that ranks against other people. That's the useful part. The useful part is the benchmarking part, not necessarily the underlying data, unless you're a researcher and you're trying to study carbon, in which case I would ask, is that the way you're going to get the best data? Or is there some other way that you're going to get data, not through a disclosure process, but through a integrated high trust process, where there's where there's less of a penalty for, or less of an incentive to put wrong data in there, or to fudge the, you know, I just think it's a full public disclosure is often very incompatible with private companies, and so you have to really decide when it's needed.
No. Okay. All right. Next question is how to identify impact investment for telehealth or for telehealth community health.
Community health. I think what you're asking, I'm going to interpret because I'm not sure exactly what you're asking. I think
the question, I'll read it verbatim. It says how to identify impact investment for telehealth for community health. Sorry.
Yeah.
I think
what you're asking is, how do I find people who will fund me? Is that what you're asking?
I think that's what's being asked.
I think that's what's being asked. Okay. So the short answer and the long answer. Yeah. The short answer is it's very difficult to find investors that match all of the criteria for you of your stage, your geography, your kind of capital you need, your industry. The long answer is we have another training on that I highly recommend that you go to. Right. I'll put the title in the chat. It's called CASE Smart Impact, and it is a online platform just for enterprises who are trying to identify and it's basically strategizing, targeting investors, and then closing the right deal for you. Right. And we have video-based modules with a ton of advice. And it's being used all over the world. So I'll put it in the chat, but it's so hard within a specific area. I don't have like a list, but there's a process that you can go through that works to get from, I'm not sure what I need, to I actually have a deal that works for me.
Okay. I may be skipping over questions. It's possible that we could go over by a minute. I hope that's not so bad, right? So we say the other question is, what are the scoring mechanisms being used that are consistent? Or are we still figuring this out? Well, I think I know where I'll go with this.
Yeah, there's very little consistency outside of like the B survey, which has scoring, or specific rating systems, which have their own internal scoring. Yeah. The stuff that I'm showing you does not have weightings attached to it. It is allowing people to put their own weightings on. So it's a level above that. This is like, what are you actually doing to manage? And then someone else can say, I think that's good, or I think that's bad. And most of the ESG systems are doing that by having their own internal weightings. The weightings, for example, of the B survey are completely transparent. You could actually pull them up on the website, and you could change them if you wanted to, weight them differently. So it's open source.
All right. Okay, I have two more questions, and I'm sorry I had to give priority to questions that came through Inessa, which you moderated, and the questions in the chat. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of those. So the last two questions. First one is, could you discuss for-profit versus philanthropy in impact investing, please? I think you did kind of cross over that before.
Can you say that again? Could
you discuss for-profit versus philanthropy vis-a-vis impact investing?
Yeah. So philanthropy can make two kinds of impact investments. Philanthropy mostly makes grants, right? They have a corpus, they have an endowment, like the Bill Gates Foundation. Bill Gates takes a bunch of money, puts it into the endowment, and the endowment spends 5% of that by law in the US on charitable purposes. As long as he spends at least 5% on a 3-year rolling average, that corpus is not taxed. So that's the quid pro quo from the government. The government says, as long as you spend something on the public good, we're going to let you live in perpetuity for the public good. When it comes to impact investing, foundations can do two kinds of investments. They can invest out of their grants, which is something they can do called a program-related investment, where they make an investment for the charitable purpose that they're also doing their grant making for. Right. Or they can invest the endowment itself. There are different constraints and different rules on both of those, but those are the only two kinds of investments that a foundation can make. The private sector can have almost anything. And so in our CASE Smart Impact Capital tool that I mentioned, we talk about 13 different kinds of capital vehicles. And we show which ones can be used by nonprofits and which ones can be used by for-profits. Most of them are interchangeable, but some of them are not. For example, equity can only be done into a for-profit entity because it's an ownership stake and you can't own a nonprofit. But if you want to know more about the different vehicles that are available to you as a nonprofit, go into CASE Smart Impact and look at the types of capital and you'll get an overview of that.
Okay, so I have to apologize because this is our last question I'm going to have to put out there, and there are a whole bunch there. Please, my sincerest apologies, we couldn't get to all. There were just way too many. So the last question we have is, do you believe that different innovation vehicles, examples of universities versus private equity, have more responsibility or interest in adopting standards?
Do different financial vehicles have more or less responsibility?
Innovation vehicles.
Which kind?
They said, do you believe that different innovation vehicles?
Innovation vehicles.
That's it. And they compared, contrasted as an example, universities or private equity. And do they have more which has more responsibility or interest in adopting standards?
Well, there's two different questions, responsibility and interest. They may not be correlated. I feel like it comes down to stakeholders to me, which is you exist to align with the interests of your stakeholders. That's what governance is about. And so there are many kinds of institutions or innovative institutions, some private equity, some hedge funds who have very, very small stakeholder groups. Universities, on the other hand, have kind of the most most complex set of stakeholders of anyone. And so I do think that every organization has a responsibility to figure out what their stakeholders care about and to govern in accordance with that. So I'm gonna hedge on your question by answering it that way. Okay. Before we end, could I just talk about what this slide is, Navin? Could I do that?
Sure, please.
So I just wanted to mention to everyone, so if you're interested in taking our course, we also have a partnership with Impact Alpha. Impact Alpha is one of the main news sources for impact field. And we are offering a little contest called the Optimizing for Impact Challenge. The first 100 people to complete the course post a certificate on their LinkedIn profile and email us. You have to email us because we don't see who completes the course otherwise. We were going to give a little prize to you, and there's still more than half of these positions are still open. So if you're interested in showing off that you have this knowledge to potential employers or to others, we're here to help you and support you in that. So I just wanted to mention, you just email your certificate to us at case@fuqua.duke.edu.
And just to underscore that, I should say that I'm also, I started doing the course as well. And I must say it's very, very, very good. So I definitely would recommend it very highly. So for sure. All right. And I think with that, we have Diana should be coming on shortly, and then we will go to close.
Unfortunately, we have now reached our cut-off time for today. So I would like to thank Cathy for making time in her very busy schedule to present to us today. Thank you so much, Cathy. It's very, very pleased to have you. So please be sure to check out the online course on Coursera. We have put the link in the chat box multiple times. I hope everyone has enjoyed the session as much as I have today. Thank you as always to everyone on our events team and at Cambridge, especially Inessa, Laura, Iolko, Nikki, who has helped us produce this event. Please be sure to check our webpage, cases.org, for future events. We do have Professor Neil Stott from Cambridge Judge Business School on November 25th. Thank you all again for joining us from all over the world in many different time zones today. Do take care and have an enjoyable rest of your day or evening.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cathy.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thanks so much for coming in. Bye-bye now.